fades from black to a desolate desert, the sun setting in the distance. A modified Toyota Hilux rumbles through the dirt road, its tires kicking up dust as dozens of men sit atop, armed and ready for battle. The sound of engines fills the silence, cutting through the heat of the moment. The camera zooms in on a pair of eyes, weary yet determined. In the heart of Sudan, a war was fought on the dusty roads of Darfur, a war not just of soldiers, but of survival. The camera cuts to burning villages, smoke rising in the background. Rebel fighters with grim faces emerge from behind a vehicle, weapons in hand. A simple car, the Toyota Hilux, transformed into a weapon of war, driving through bloodied roads where families lost everything and history was written in the ashes. The music intensifies as the screen flashes scenes of desperation, soldiers clashing and chaos unfolding. But who were the real heroes? The ones fighting to survive, or the ones who brought this war to life? The camera freezes on a young rebel, eyes locked with the viewer. This is not just a story of war. This is the story of resilience, of defiance, and the battle for a land lost in time. Imagine a land stretched beneath a golden sun, where the earth is cracked and the air is thick with the dust of countless battles. This is Sudan, a land of ancient stories, of people bound by their history. And yet, in the early 2000s, it became the stage for a conflict unlike any the world had seen before. The year is 2003, and in the heart of Darfur, a remote region in the western part of Sudan, the world would witness a war that would go on to leave deep scars across the land. It was a war fought not just with weapons, but with old wounds, ancient rivalries, and the struggle for survival. This is the story of what became known as the Land Cruiser Wars. Let me tell you of the strange and unlikely heroes of this war. Not kings, not generals, but ordinary people, armed with little more than their courage and the vehicle they relied on most. The Toyota Land Cruiser, an old, rusted car for some, but for these warriors, it became more than just a vehicle. It was a symbol of defiance, a tool of survival, and a fierce reminder that in these lands, nothing could be taken for granted. Picture, if you will, the desert roads. The sun burns down on the cracked earth, and the sound of engines fills the air. These land cruisers, modified, armored, and often carrying a machine gun mounted on top, speed across the rugged terrain. They belong to the rebels of Darfur, a group of fighters who came together out of a shared desire for freedom and justice. They are not soldiers in the traditional sense. They are guerrillas, men and women who fight because they have no choice. But they are not alone. On the other side stands the government of Sudan, led by a powerful man named Omar al-Bashir, a man who once ruled with an iron fist, willing to do anything to maintain his control. The government's army, heavily armed and backed by militias known as the Janjaweed, march across the land, their objective clear: to suppress the rebellion, to crush those who dare to challenge the established order. And so, the conflict begins. Rebels in their modified land cruisers and the Sudanese army in their heavy trucks and armored vehicles face off in the dust and heat of Darfur. But what started as a small rebellion soon ignites into a fierce struggle that stretches across the entire country. The war in Darfur is not just about soldiers and guns. It is a war of identities, a war where two very different groups clash, each believing that they have a rightful claim to the land, to the future of Sudan. On one side are the Afro-Arab Sudanese, a group that has long been in power, whose ancestors once ruled the deserts of Sudan. On the other side are the non-Arab Africans, the native people of Darfur, whose ancestors lived in the region long before the winds of change brought Arabs into the land. It's a war that grows larger with each passing day. And as the rebels fight for their freedom, they find themselves facing not just the might of the Sudanese military, but a world that watches from afar, unsure of what to do. Now we must move beyond the battlefield, beyond the land cruisers and the gunfire, and begin to understand the roots of this war. To understand what drives the people of Darfur to fight, and what pushes the government to maintain its grip at any cost. Let us step back in time to a land where the lines between Arab and African are drawn not just in the sand, but in the hearts of the people. Let us explore the ancient history that has led us to this moment in 2003, when the land cruiser wars begin and the fate of Sudan is forever changed. To understand the war that unfolded in Darfur, we must first go back to a time when the land itself seemed to carry the weight of its people's histories. Sudan, a land of vast deserts and rich cultures, has long been a crossroads for different peoples, ideas, and empires. And it is here, in this ancient land, that the roots of conflict were planted long before the land cruiser roared through the dusty roads of Darfur. Let us begin with Darfur's history, a land where tribes and ethnic groups have coexisted for centuries, each with their own traditions, beliefs, and ways of life. But beneath this peaceful surface, there lay a deep divide, the divide between the Afro-Arab populations. The Afro-Arabs, a mix of indigenous Africans and Arabs, have long been the dominant ethnic group in Sudan, with their roots tracing back to the Arab expansion in the region. The rest of Sudan's people, however, were predominantly non-Arab Africans, including many from the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa tribes. These groups, who lived in Darfur for thousands of years, spoke different languages, followed distinct customs, and often found themselves at odds with the Arab-dominated government of Sudan. The Arab-African divide was not just a cultural difference, it was a matter of power. Over time, the Arab population, particularly those in the capital city of Khartoum, came to control much of Sudan's political and military power. Meanwhile, the non-Arab African communities, many of whom resided in the western regions like Darfur, were left marginalized with their grievances largely ignored by the central government. The story of Darfur is also the story of colonialism, a chapter that would forever alter Sudan's fate. The winds of change first arrived in Sudan in the 19th century, when the British Empire made Sudan a part of its colonial holdings. The British, seeking to maintain control, implemented a divide and rule strategy, further deepening the divides between the ethnic groups. They favored the Arab elite and left the African tribes in Darfur and other regions to struggle in the shadows. This created a sense of resentment among the African communities, especially those in Darfur, who felt as though their land and people were being neglected, oppressed, and exploited. When Sudan gained independence in 1956, the hopes for a unified nation were dashed. The Afro-Arab elites took control, and the non-Arab African groups found themselves pushed to the margins once again. The early years of Sudan's independence were filled with promises of equality, but for the people of Darfur, this was nothing more than an illusion. The new government in Khartoum, composed mostly of Arabs, favored the Arab African population and continued to marginalize the rest of the country's diverse ethnic groups. By the 1970s, it became clear that Sudan's problems were not just about politics. It was about identity, about who belonged to the land and who didn't. The people of Darfur, who had once been masters of their own land, now found themselves displaced in their own country, living under a government that didn't see them as equal. The tension reached a boiling point in the 1980s. The government, increasingly controlled by Arab elites, began to exploit the country's natural resources, especially the wealth of oil and agriculture, to benefit the Arab majority population, while the African tribes in Darfur and other marginalized areas received little to nothing. The divide between the Arab elites and the non-Arab African tribes grew deeper, and the simmering anger of the Darfurians became impossible to ignore. It was in this context that the first sparks of rebellion began to fly. The people of Darfur, long ignored and treated as second-class citizens, began to organize. By the 1990s, groups like the Sudanese Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement began to form in Darfur. These groups were not initially focused on overthrowing the government, but on securing autonomy and equal rights for Darfur's people. They sought to change the power dynamics in Sudan and demand a greater share of the resources, recognition, and opportunities that had been denied to them for so long. But the Sudanese government, under the leadership of Omar al-Bashir, would not entertain any talk of autonomy for Darfur. Instead, the government labeled these rebel groups as terrorists, and by 2003, the war in Darfur exploded in a way no one could have predicted. The government's response was brutal. They called upon militias, the Janjaweed, to help suppress the growing rebellion. Armed with weapons, a shared hatred for the African tribes, and a desire to maintain control over the region, the Janjaweed began their campaign of terror. The Land Cruiser, once a symbol of ordinary transportation, became a weapon of war, as the Janjaweed used these vehicles to carry out raids, attacks, and massacres. The vehicles, modified with machine guns and rocket launchers, allowed the militia to launch hit-and-run attacks on Darfurian villages, burning them to the ground and displacing millions of people. At the heart of the conflict was a desire for recognition of Darfur's people, their history, and their claim to the land they had lived on for centuries. The rebels weren't just fighting for freedom. They were fighting for their identity, for the right to be seen as equals in a nation that had long ignored them. And so, what began as a fight for autonomy in Darfur grew into a full-blown war, a war that would draw in not only Sudan's military forces, but also international actors, each with their own interests in the outcome. The stakes were no longer just about the future of Sudan's marginalized people. They were about the control of the land, the wealth beneath it, and the future of an entire nation. The story of the war in Darfur begins not with grand battles, but with the quiet rumblings of a land that had been pushed too far, pushed by inequality, by years of neglect, and by a desire for something that had been denied for far too long. It was the year 2003 when the first true clash broke out. The Darfur rebels, a loose coalition of fighters from the region's non-Arab African tribes, had been preparing for years, driven by a desire for autonomy and justice. The Sudanese government, led by Omar al-Bashir, had long ignored the cries for help from the people of Darfur. It was clear that a reckoning was coming, but no one, least of all the government, was prepared for the violence that would soon follow. In 2003, as tensions flared, the Janjaweed militias emerged as the most feared force in the region. Initially, These militias were no more than bands of nomadic Arabs who had been used by the government in a strategic attempt to crush the rebellion. Armed with Kalashnikov rifles and mounted on horseback, they were given the green light to target rebels and civilians alike. But what started as a government-backed response to the Darfur rebellion quickly escalated into a campaign of terror. The Janjaweed militias, whose name itself means devils on horseback, became infamous for their ruthless attacks on Darfurian villages. They would raid towns, burn homes, and rape, kill, and displace innocent people. The government, under Bashir's orders, not only failed to stop them, but actively armed and supported them. In many ways, the government's strategy was clear: total annihilation of the opposition by any means necessary. And so, the Land Cruiser, once a simple work vehicle, became the symbol of war in Darfur. Across the vast desert, the roar of a Toyota Land Cruiser could be heard. A vehicle once used for transportation, now converted into a war machine. The rebel groups, with their limited resources, had adapted quickly to the needs of warfare. The Land Cruiser, a symbol of both the rebels' resourcefulness and their desperation, became the perfect vehicle for their guerrilla tactics. The Land Cruiser, often armed with a mounted machine gun on its roof and modified with armor to withstand gunfire, was a versatile tool for the rebels. The jungle-like terrain of Darfur, with its rocky hills, desert pathways, and dusty roads, was the perfect place for these modified vehicles to roam. Rebels would strike quickly, hitting Sudanese military positions or Janjaweed camps, before disappearing into the wilderness, where their vehicles, with their rugged durability, allowed them to evade pursuit. It was a hit-and-run strategy, one that exploited the Janjaweed's larger, slower vehicles and the government's inability to patrol the vast, arid land effectively. These Land Cruisers were not just vehicles, they were weapons of survival, and the war itself was being shaped by these modifications, these creative uses of technology. But the Land Cruiser's role wasn't just as a tool for the rebels. It became a symbol of the conflict in Darfur, a symbol that transcended the battlefield. It was a familiar vehicle, one that many people in Sudan had seen on the roads for decades, yet now it was an object of fear, as it brought the violence of war directly to the people of Darfur. As the war in Darfur intensified, the world began to take notice, though at first it was little more than a murmur. The international community watched, unsure of how to respond to a crisis that seemed too far removed, too complicated, and too entrenched for simple solutions. Yet, as the violence escalated and the death tolls mounted, the whispers became shouts. In 2004, the United Nations, along with human rights organizations, began to describe the situation in Darfur as a humanitarian crisis, one that could no longer be ignored. But it wasn't until 2005 that the language shifted from mere humanitarian concern to accusations of genocide. The Sudanese government's tactics, burning villages, systematic rape, and mass killings were nothing short of ethnic cleansing. In 2009, as the world looked on, the International Criminal Court, ICC, issued a historic warrant for Omar al-Bashir's arrest, charging him with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Bashir became the first sitting head of state to be charged by the ICC. The charges were a bold move, a global attempt to bring justice to the people of Darfur, but Sudan's government refused to comply, branding the charges as part of an international conspiracy to undermine Sudan's sovereignty. Despite these charges, Bashir continued to rule Sudan with an iron fist, using his military might and Janjaweed militias to maintain control. Meanwhile, the world's response to the conflict was fragmented at best. Peacekeeping forces were sent by the United Nations and the African Union, but they were too few and too ill-equipped to make a significant difference. The violence in Darfur persisted, and the world watched in silence as the Sudanese government continued its campaign of terror. As we continue our journey through the story of Sudan's war, we must ask ourselves, what happened in Darfur was not just a tragedy of local consequence. It was a war that redefined international diplomacy and shaped the fate of Sudan in ways that still echo today. The rise of the Janjaweed, the rebel forces, and the land cruiser wars marked the beginning of a conflict that continues to devastate the region. And even as the world struggles with its response, one thing remains clear. The people of Darfur, like so many others around the world, were caught in the crossfire of power, politics, and history. The question now is not only about the future of Sudan, but about the responsibility of the world in the face of such horrors. Will the international community continue to watch from the sidelines? Or will the lessons of Darfur finally inspire real change? The winds of change were blowing across Sudan in the year 1989. But these were not winds of peace or of progress. They were winds of unrest, of ambition, and of a desire for power. Winds that would sweep away the fragile democratic government in place and bring Omar al-Bashir to power. Bashir, a colonel in Sudan's military, had spent years rising through the ranks, observing the political chaos that had plagued the country since its independence. Sudan had been through a series of unstable governments, with military coups and civilian unrest making the political landscape a battleground. The Cold War was in full swing, and Sudan, like many nations, was caught in the crossfire of superpower politics. But it was within the walls of Sudan's military that Bashir would begin to craft his path to power. On the 30th of June 1989, Omar al-Bashir led a military coup against the sitting democratic government. With the support of key military figures, Bashir seized control of the country, ousting the civilian government led by Sadiq al-Mahdi. The coup was swift and efficient, and within hours, Bashir declared himself the new ruler of Sudan. His rise to power was marked by promise of stability, of order, and of a unified Sudan. But in reality, it marked the beginning of an era of dictatorship, a rule that would span more than 3 decades. Bashir's military dictatorship was swift, brutal, and absolute. He wasted no time in consolidating his power, dismantling the remnants of the democratic system, and taking full control of the country's political, military, and economic structures. The Sudanese people, weary from years of conflict and uncertainty, initially welcomed Bashir's promises of stability. But beneath the surface, something darker was taking shape. Under Bashir's rule, Sudan's military became the heart of the government. Bashir's Islamist agenda grew stronger, and soon the government was radicalized, implementing harsh Islamic laws that alienated many, particularly in the south. But the true nature of his leadership would reveal itself through his handling of Sudan's rebellions, and most notably, through his response to the Darfur crisis. As the years passed and the world shifted, Bashir's grip on power grew tighter. But he faced challenges, both from internal divisions and growing rebel movements. Sudan's south had long been a hotbed of resistance, with rebel groups fighting for autonomy and the right to govern themselves. But it was in Darfur, a region far removed from the political centers of Sudan, that Bashir's most brutal strategy would unfold. By the time the conflict in Darfur erupted in 2003, Bashir had already established himself as a ruler willing to do anything to maintain control. His military strategy was ruthless, but it was effective. He knew that to crush rebellion, he needed to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, to make them unable to resist. And so, he turned to one of the most unconventional and violent tools at his disposal, the Janjaweed militias. The Janjaweed, originally formed as loose bands of armed men, had roots in Sudan's Arab tribal militias. These militias were often composed of nomadic Arabs from northern Sudan, who had long had their own tensions with the non-Arab African groups in the Darfur region. However, under Bashir's guidance, these militias transformed into something much more dangerous, an instrument of terror. Bashir, in his desperation to suppress the rebels in Darfur, armed and organized these militias into a brutal force that would bring death and destruction to the people of Darfur. The Janjaweed were not a conventional army. They did not wear uniforms or follow the usual rules of warfare. Instead, they were guerrilla fighters, warriors mounted on horses, camels, and modified vehicles, armed with automatic rifles and machine guns. They terrorized the villages of Darfur, using hit-and-run tactics to strike swiftly and disappear into the desert. The targets were not just rebels, but civilians. Villages were razed, and entire communities were massacred. The Janjaweed's brutality left an indelible scar on Darfur's population, as they used terror not just to crush resistance, but to send a clear message. The government had total control. The government, under Bashir's orders, backed the Janjaweed in exchange for their loyalty. These militias were often given free rein to attack civilians, burn villages, and commit atrocities with little fear of reprisal. The goal was clear: total submission. And with the Janjaweed at his side, Bashir believed that he could stamp out the rebellion once and for all. But there was more to the strategy than just brute force. Bashir's military approach was one of dividing and conquering. By arming the Janjaweed and pitting them against Darfur's non-Arab African populations, he was able to deepen the ethnic divides in the region, creating a racialized conflict that would divide communities and make it harder for any peace efforts to succeed. As the Darfur rebels fought for independence, justice, and recognition, they found themselves not just battling the Sudanese military, but an unforgiving militia that was as much a symbol of Sudan's power as it was a reminder of the government's cruelty. The Janjaweed's attacks were not limited to physical violence. They sought to erase the cultural and social fabric of Darfur. Towns were wiped off the map, and entire generations of families were lost. In this climate of fear, Bashir's control over Sudan was only strengthened. The violence in Darfur became his tool for maintaining power, and the world, for years, watched in silence as millions were displaced and hundreds of thousands were killed in the name of a government's desire to remain in power at any cost. Bashir's success in using the Janjaweed militias to suppress the rebellion in Darfur was not just a military victory. It was a message to Sudan and the world. Bashir had shown that he could use extreme force to maintain his control. But as the conflict escalated and the world began to recognize the scale of the atrocities, Bashir's grip on Sudan became more fragile. In 2005, as genocide accusations were leveled against his government, the international community took note. The International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Bashir, accusing him of crimes against humanity and war crimes. It was a bold move, one that would follow him for the rest of his rule. But despite the charges, Bashir refused to step down. Instead, he doubled down, using the same brutal tactics that had kept him in power for years. The Janjaweed, now transformed into a paramilitary force known as the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, continued their campaign of terror with the blessing of the government. The RSF, led by Bashir's allies, became a tool for ethnic cleansing and the systematic destruction of Darfur's population. And so, while Bashir's rule was defined by violence and repression, it was also defined by one constant: his unwavering desire to stay in power. It was a desire that would lead him to commit atrocities on a scale that the world would never forget. From the dust of Darfur, a new figure rose, a man whose name would come to symbolize both the brutal power of Sudan's military and the shifting sands of political loyalty. His name was Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, but the world would come to know him simply as General Hamidti. Hamidti's rise to power was not one of tradition or nobility. Born into the humble Riziga tribe in western Sudan, Hamidti grew up in the remote regions of Darfur, far from the halls of power in Khartoum. He started not as a soldier, but as a nomadic militiaman, one of the many men in the region who lived off the land, moving from place to place in search of cattle and survival. It was here, in the unforgiving desert, that Hamidti first learned the brutal art of guerrilla warfare, a skill that would serve him well in the years to come. But it was the Janjaweed militias, those infamous bands of armed fighters who had been unleashed by the government to crush rebellion in Darfur, that would bring Hamidti to prominence. As a young man, he quickly rose through the ranks, proving himself to be a capable and ruthless leader. The Janjaweed, often described as devils on horseback, became synonymous with terror in Darfur, and Hamidti, as their leader, was no different. His rise was tied to his ability to lead his men with an iron fist, crushing opposition and maintaining control in the midst of chaos. As the war in Darfur raged on, Hamidti's leadership of the Janjaweed didn't go unnoticed. The government, desperate to maintain control in the region, began to realize the value of his militias. By the early 2010s, Sudan's government had officially recruited Hamidti's forces into their ranks, forming what would eventually become the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. This new force, essentially a paramilitary extension of the Sudanese army, was tasked with combating rebels, securing borders, and suppressing dissent in the most remote corners of Sudan. The RSF under Hamidti's command was both feared and revered. The men in his forces were battle-hardened veterans of the Darfur conflict, accustomed to violence and brutality. Under his leadership, they grew more powerful, becoming an indispensable tool for the Sudanese government in maintaining order. But this strength would come at a price. As Hamidti's power grew, so did the tensions within Sudan's ruling elite. By 2019, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. The Sudanese people, fed up with years of oppression under President Omar al-Bashir, had risen up in a wave of protests demanding the end of his reign. The streets of Khartoum were filled with people chanting for change, calling for democracy, and seeking a future free of Bashir's oppressive rule. But behind the scenes, the power struggle had already begun. Bashir was a man surrounded by loyalists, but his military command was divided. On one side, there was General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of the Sudanese army, a man deeply embedded in Sudan's military hierarchy, known for his strategic mind and disciplined approach to power. On the other side, Hamidti, the leader of the RSF, had become one of the most powerful men in Sudan, thanks to his control over the elite paramilitary forces. In April 2019, Bashir's government was toppled by a military coup. But the story was far from over. The coup did not bring an end to the conflict. It only opened the door to a new chapter of internal strife. In the wake of Bashir's fall, the Sudanese military formed a Transitional Military Council, TMC, to take control of the country. General al-Burhan became its leader, but he did not have complete control. Hamidti, with his powerful RSF, saw this as an opportunity to increase his influence. As the military council tried to stabilize the country and navigate the difficult path to a civilian government, Hamidti began to position himself as a key political player. He sought to expand his power, not just within the military, but in the broader political arena as well. For a time, al-Burhan and Hamidti were uneasy allies, both working together to maintain the fragile peace in Sudan. But it was clear that their relationship was fraught with tension. While al-Burhan sought a more conventional military rule, Hamidti, backed by his RSF, began to see himself as the true ruler of Sudan. The struggle for control was not just about political power. It was a battle for Sudan's future, a battle between two men who wanted to shape the country in their own image. The tension between al-Burhan and Hamidti came to a head in 2021, when the military took further control of the country. In what many saw as a power grab, al-Burhan dissolved the transitional government and took full control of Sudan, sidelining civilian leaders. Hamidti, who had hoped to maintain his influence, found himself at a crossroads. His RSF, while incredibly powerful, was not enough to secure his vision of Sudan's future. The power struggle reached its zenith, and by 2023, the country was on the brink of another civil war. The once uneasy alliance between al-Burhan and Hamidti began to crack. As both sides sought to consolidate their power, the country was plunged into further chaos. Their struggle was no longer just about politics. It was about survival, about who would control Sudan, about who would shape its destiny. And so, the fight for Sudan's future continued, a battle between two men who, despite their past alliances, were now bitter rivals, each seeking to secure their place in the country's history. In the streets of Khartoum, the winds of change were stirring. The year was 2019, and for the people of Sudan, it felt as if the long night of oppression was finally coming to an end. After 3 decades under the iron grip of Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese people could no longer remain silent. It was a moment that had been years in the making, a moment born out of hunger, frustration, and the will to live in a country free from dictatorship. It began as a modest protest. In December 2018, sparked by a rise in bread prices and the government's economic failures, a small group of Sudanese citizens gathered in the city of Atbara in the north. They demanded economic relief, but as protests spread across the country, the demand for democracy and freedom became clearer. The calls for Bashir's resignation rang out in the streets, echoing through the country like a wave breaking over the shores of an ancient land. What started as a protest against economic hardship quickly turned into an uprising, a full-scale rebellion against Bashir's regime. The people of Sudan, tired of decades of corruption and injustice, gathered in the capital, Khartoum, chanting freedom, peace, justice. The protests grew, not just in size but in intensity. People from every walk of life, students, workers, mothers and fathers, took to the streets, demanding change. They were tired of living in fear. They were tired of being ignored, and they were determined to take back their country. The movement was leaderless. No single group or political party led the charge. Instead, it was a collective cry from the heart of Sudan. The youth of the nation, the ones who had grown up under Bashir's rule, were the ones who took to the streets first. They were the ones who believed that Sudan could be better. As they rallied in front of the army headquarters in Khartoum, they demanded that the military take action and remove Bashir from power. In April 2019, after months of protest, Bashir's rule finally began to crumble. The military, once loyal to him, started to turn. The pressure of the protests, combined with economic instability, finally pushed the Sudanese army to act. Bashir, once a towering figure of power, found himself ousted in a military coup. It happened quickly, almost without warning. On April 11, 2019, Bashir was arrested and forced to step down. The people of Sudan, who had fought for months, celebrated in the streets. It was a moment of triumph, a feeling of liberation that had eluded them for so long. The dictator who had held them in his grasp for over 30 years was gone, and the country was free. At least, that's what they believed. But the joy would not last long. As the people celebrated, a new power struggle was beginning. The army, under General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, took control of the country. At first, it seemed like a natural transition. The military was seen as the savior of Sudan, the force that had ended Bashir's brutal rule. But as the days passed, it became clear that the military had no intention of relinquishing power. They sought to maintain control, to shape Sudan's future in their image. As the military took control, a new chapter began, a chapter that would leave Sudan teetering on the edge of democracy and dictatorship. The Transitional Military Council, TMC, was formed, a coalition of military leaders who would govern Sudan during a transitional period. At the head of this council was General al-Burhan, the newly appointed leader of Sudan's military. But al-Burhan was not alone. General Hamidi, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, had become a powerful figure in the new Sudanese order. He had been one of the key players in Bashir's downfall, but now he too sought to cement his own power. Hamidi and al-Burhan, though both military men, had different ideas of what Sudan's future should look like. Their growing tensions would shape the future of the country for years to come. The TMC promised to oversee a transition to civilian rule, to establish democracy and give the people of Sudan the future they had long desired. But as the months went by, it became clear that the military had no intention of handing over power easily. The military leadership's commitment to a true transition was questioned, and their grip on the country remained tight. Despite the promises, the protests continued. The people of Sudan, who had risen up to remove one dictator, found themselves facing a new challenge: the military junta. The Transitional Military Council claimed they were only trying to maintain order, but their actions told a different story. In June 2019, as the people of Sudan continued to demand civilian rule, the military responded with brutal force. Security forces under the command of Hamidi's RSF launched a violent crackdown on protesters. Dozens were killed, hundreds were injured, and the hopes of a peaceful transition to democracy were dashed. The massacre that followed became a symbol of the military's reluctance to surrender power. For the people of Sudan, the promise of a new era seemed to be slipping away. The military junta, with al-Burhan at its head and Hamiti by his side, stood firm, unwilling to relinquish control. Sudan was at a crossroads, torn between the aspirations of a nation seeking democracy and the reality of a military elite determined to hold on to power. And so the revolution continued, but it was no longer just about removing a dictator. It was about the fight for the soul of Sudan, a fight that would pit the Sudanese people against their military leaders in a struggle for control over the country's future. By 2023, the hopes for a peaceful transition in Sudan had all but faded. The promises made during the revolution of 2019, the aspirations for democracy, and the dreams of a free Sudan were now distant memories, buried beneath the weight of a new all-consuming war. The conflict that began in Darfur had spread, engulfing the entire nation. The Sudanese Civil War, a war that had always simmered beneath the surface, had reached its boiling point. In April 2023, the fighting escalated into full-scale war as the two most powerful factions in Sudan's military, General al-Burhan's Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and General Hamiti's Rapid Support Forces, RSF, turned on each other in a battle for the future of the country. The world watched in shock as Khartoum, the capital city, became the epicenter of the violence. Once a thriving city, it now lay in ruins, with airstrikes, artillery bombardments, and urban warfare tearing apart the streets. The sounds of gunfire echoed in the streets, and the sky above was filled with smoke. The fighting was not just a military clash, it was a battle for control, a struggle for Sudan's soul, and no one knew who would emerge victorious. The violence quickly spread to other parts of the country: Darfur, South Kordofan, Blue Nile, regions that had already suffered under years of neglect and conflict. And yet, even as the RSF and SAF clashed, the war seemed to defy simple explanation. It was more than just two generals fighting for power. It was a war fueled by ambition, betrayal, and the deep-seated ethnic and political divisions that had plagued Sudan for generations. As the fighting raged in Khartoum, the world began to pay closer attention. The RSF, which had once been Bashir's loyal ally, had grown into a formidable military force, one that was now challenging the Sudanese armed forces for control of the country. The battle between al-Burhan and Hamiti was no longer just a power struggle between two military leaders. It was a race for dominance over Sudan's future. In the early months of 2023, the fighting intensified, and neither side seemed willing to back down. The RSF, made up of Hamiti's elite paramilitary forces, had become a power unto itself. Their land cruisers, once symbols of rebellion in Darfur, were now used to strike fear into the heart of the capital. The Sudanese armed forces, led by al-Burhan, had the advantage of a well-equipped, traditional military, but they were also overextended and struggled to maintain control over key parts of the country. The civilian population trapped between these two warring forces bore the brunt of the violence. Thousands were displaced, and hundreds of thousands lost their lives as the fighting consumed homes, neighborhoods, and communities. Khartoum became a battlefield where residents sought refuge in makeshift shelters, but nowhere was truly safe. The city, once the cultural and political heart of Sudan, had now become a city of chaos. The international community watched as the conflict spiraled out of control. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations struggled to provide aid to the growing number of displaced persons, but their efforts were hindered by the ongoing fighting and the lack of access to key regions. The war in Sudan had once again become a humanitarian disaster, with millions in need of urgent assistance. But as the world focused on the suffering of Sudan's people, other players had begun to take notice. Sudan, with its wealth of natural resources, especially oil and minerals, had long been a strategic prize for foreign powers. And in 2023, as the civil war intensified, the global powers began to engage, each with their own interests. Sudan's civil war in 2023 was not just a domestic issue. It had become a geopolitical struggle. As the conflict unfolded, regional and global powers began to take sides, either directly or indirectly. One of the key players in Sudan's war was Russia. In recent years, Russia had established a growing influence in Africa, particularly through its mercenary group, the Wagner Group. In Sudan, Russia saw an opportunity to expand its influence and gain access to Sudan's gold and mineral resources. The Wagner Group, linked to the Kremlin, had a presence in Sudan, operating in areas where Sudan's military forces were weak. It was reported that Russia had struck deals with Hamitis forces, providing military support in exchange for access to Sudan's wealth. On the other side, China had long been involved in Sudan's resource extraction, especially in the oil industry. China's influence in Sudan was primarily economic, as it sought to secure energy resources to fuel its growing demand for oil. Despite its focus on trade and investment, China was drawn into Sudan's war as its economic interests became entangled with the political crisis. The United States, once an ally of Sudan under Bashir's rule, had been critical of the regime's human rights abuses and had imposed sanctions on the country. But with the rise of the military junta, the US found itself in a delicate position. It continued to call for democratic reforms, but its diplomatic options were limited. The US also provided humanitarian aid, though it had to navigate the complex political terrain created by the military's hold on power. In the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, UAE, had their own stake in Sudan. Both countries had long had ties to the Sudanese military and had provided financial support to the regime. With the outbreak of war in 2023, Saudi Arabia was particularly concerned with the stability of the region, as Sudan's conflict could spill over into neighboring countries like Chad and Ethiopia, further destabilizing the Horn of Africa. Finally, Egypt, which shares a border with Sudan, was deeply concerned with the implications of the conflict. Sudan's instability posed a direct threat to Egypt's security and water access, as the Nile River, a vital resource for Egypt, flows through Sudan. Egypt had long been an ally of the Sudanese military and played a key role in supporting al-Burhan's regime, though the ongoing war made it difficult for Egypt to maintain its influence. In this web of international interests, Sudan had become a battleground not just for its own people, but for the global powers seeking to control its future. The war was no longer simply about the future of Sudan. It had become a test case for the world's competing geopolitical ambitions, with resources, influence, and regional stability all hanging in the balance. The war in Sudan has been a tale of suffering, division, and unresolved dreams. For decades, the people of Sudan have endured one hardship after another. The Darfur conflict, the rise of military dictatorship, and the 2019 revolution all culminated in the devastating violence we see today. But the story does not end with the battles on the streets of Khartoum or the dusty deserts of Darfur. It is a story that will stretch into the future of Sudan for years to come. The long-term consequences of Sudan's civil war are already clear. Millions have been displaced, their homes and villages reduced to rubble, their lives torn apart by a war that seems endless. The political landscape has been forever changed. The hopes for a peaceful, democratic Sudan have been replaced by a brutal struggle for power between two generals, al-Burhan and Hamiti, whose rivalry has made it nearly impossible for any meaningful peace to take root. But the consequences of this war go beyond politics. The human toll is immense. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, families torn apart, and entire generations left without hope. The humanitarian crisis is one of the worst the world has seen in recent years, with refugees flooding neighboring countries and aid organizations struggling to meet the growing needs of those caught in the crossfire. As the war rages on, it leaves behind a country devastated, its people broken, and its future uncertain. The question now is, will Sudan ever know peace? Will the violence that has claimed so many lives finally come to an end? Or will the conflict spiral into even more chaos with no end in sight? We must ask ourselves, what is the future of Sudan? Will the people of this nation ever see the end of bloodshed? Will the dreams of the Sudanese youth, their hopes for freedom, justice, and democracy be realized? Or will the country remain trapped in an endless cycle of violence with no escape in sight? The power struggle between al-Burhan and Hamiti continues to deepen, and with each passing day, the chances for peace seem to slip further away. Will Sudan's generals ever come to the table, or will they remain locked in their positions, willing to sacrifice the lives of their people for the sake of their own power? We must consider the broader implications of this war on regional stability. Sudan's instability threatens not only its own people, but the entire Horn of Africa. Neighboring countries already grappling with their own challenges are being pulled into Sudan's war, whether through the displacement of refugees or the risk of spillover violence. This is not just a Sudanese problem. It is a regional one. But amidst the violence, there is hope. There are those who continue to fight for humanity, for dignity, and for peace. The international community has responded to Sudan's crisis, though perhaps not as quickly or effectively as it should. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations have provided much-needed aid to the millions of people affected by the war. Yet, as the fighting continues, these organizations are stretched thin, unable to meet the scale of the needs on the ground. Countries like the United States, Saudi Arabia, and China have all been involved in Sudan's future, not just through diplomacy, but also through their economic interests. Yet, as the world focuses on its geopolitical interests, Sudan's people remain at the mercy of the two generals vying for control of the country. The humanitarian crisis is far from over. Millions are still displaced, living in camps and makeshift shelters, their futures uncertain. Children go without education, families are separated, and healthcare is barely available. The cost of the war is measured not just in lives lost, but in the future of an entire generation. As we reflect on the tragedy unfolding in Sudan, we are reminded that this war is not just a distant conflict. It is a human tragedy, and it is our collective responsibility to help bring it to an end. The international community must do more. It is not enough to watch from the sidelines. Sudan's people need action. They need peace, they need support, and they need hope. We must continue to support humanitarian efforts, push for peace talks, and hold those responsible for the violence accountable. The United Nations, NGOs, and governments around the world must come together to provide real solutions, not just temporary relief. Sudan needs a lasting peace, one that is built on the foundations of justice, reconciliation, and the recognition of human rights for all its people. The future of Sudan is not yet written. It is still possible to change the course of this war, to bring an end to the violence, and to give the people of Sudan a chance at a peaceful, prosperous future. But that future requires all of us, the international community, the Sudanese people, and the leaders who hold the power, to come together and to do what is necessary to bring about lasting peace.